Basically, the thesis, or what I'm going to talk about, is why Canada lost its bid for a Security Council seat back in October. First time Canada had lost a bid in decades, lost to Portugal, despite incredible advantages that Canada has in terms of size of population, economy, etc. Despite spending a couple $100,000 in wooing diplomats from around the world, buying them very fancy bottles of maple syrup. Despite all those efforts, the Harper government lost its bid for the Security Council seat. And I see that as a victory, an important victory for those who believe in international solidarity, who believe in a more just world. And the thesis of the talk tonight really is that the reason for the Harper government losing the bid for the Security Council is because it pissed off too much of the international community. And it's been using its foreign policy as a way to play to the extreme sectors of the Conservative Party base. The evangelical Christian Zionists, right-wing Jews, military-industrial complex types, the mining companies, and the old Cold Warriors. And it went so far in that direction, and largely continues to go so far in that direction, and there was a backlash. And the backlash from an institution, the UN, that in my opinion is very far from a properly moralistic body. That's how far Harper went in the extreme direction, that even the UN and international diplomacy, with all the advantages that Canada has, still lost. And the reasons or list of examples of the Harper government being offside with the international community is unfortunately quite extensive. Refusing to call for the human right to water, refusing to sign the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which they have sort of subsequently signed, but in a sort of half measure. Opposing consensus at the Rotterdam Convention to ban asbestos, hindering climate change discussions. Harper government repeatedly was given the Fossil of the Day award by environmental groups for obstructing climate change negotiations at a whole series of different forums. At one forum in Bangkok last year, after a Canadian proposal to scrap Kyoto as the basis of negotiations, the delegates from the Global South actually got up and walked out of the meeting in response to the Canadian proposal. So there's a whole series of different international forums where the Harper government has been offside with much of, or most of, the rest of the countries in the world. One reason, without a doubt, that contributed to Canada's losing its seat at the Security Council is the question, or is the Harper government's Israel no matter what policy. Despite the fact that the current government in Israel is an extreme right-wing government that continues to dispossess Palestinians, that launched a month-long campaign against Lebanon in the summer of 2006, killed about 1,200 people, destroyed much of the country. For the Harper government, that's a measured response. When they launched a 22-day campaign against Gaza 2 years ago that leave about 1,400 Palestinians dead, mostly civilians, the Harper government continues in its pro-Israel policy. And really the list of examples of this pro-Israel policy is almost endless. Really, it would take a whole night of discussion to go through them, repeatedly being the only country in the United Nations Human Rights Council voting in support of policies, voting against policies that are calling for Israel to change course. A couple recent examples at something called the Forum for the Future. There's lots of seats up front here, and there's some in the back there. At the Forum for the Future, just recently, 9 days ago, which is a body that brings some North African and Middle Eastern countries to the, and G8 countries together, the Harper government blocked a final paragraph on Palestine. The official from Qatar said there had been an agreement. However, the Canadians insisted on not including a paragraph on Palestine. And that despite lobbying from other G8 countries to support this paragraph, we had, about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, Canada is the first country to pull out of the Third World Conference Against Racism. They were also the first country to pull out of the 2009, the Second World Conference Against Racism. Israel was the second country to pull out. And that's because at the First World Conference Against Racism, supporters of Israel dubbed criticism of Israel, the criticism of Zionism as racism. During the bombing campaign against Gaza 2 years ago, countries around the world criticized what Israel was doing. The government in Venezuela expelled Israel's ambassador and then broke off diplomatic relations. But Israel didn't have to worry because Canada was there to help out. And Canada actually took over Israel's diplomatic relations in Venezuela. So today, in Venezuela, Canada is Israel, diplomatically speaking. An example of the extent or the concrete support that the Harper government has given to Israel's ongoing onslaught against Palestinians is the fact they've made it it's openly acceptable to raise money for charities in Canada that support Israeli charities involved in occupied territories. So it's now legal, and you can receive a tax credit to raise money in Canada to send to charities in Israel that contravene, that are building settlements that contravene international law and even contravene ostensibly the Canadian government's policy on the matter. At the same time, of course, it's illegal. Not a question of receiving a tax credit, subsidy from the government. It's actually just illegal to provide funding to most or many Palestinian political factions. Another example of this concrete support Canada has been providing to Israel's occupation is they've been supporting the most compliant Palestinian political faction. Most disturbingly, through something called Operation Proteus. People familiar? Anyone heard of Operation Proteus? No one? Maybe a few people that don't want to put their hands up. Operation Proteus is Canada's second largest deployment after Afghanistan, according to Peter Kent. It's only 18 troops, so it's much smaller, but it's Canada's military mission in the West Bank. And it's not just a military mission. There's the RCMP, Foreign Affairs is there, Border Services, and other departments of the federal government. And what it is building a Palestinian security force to, on one hand, combat the rise of Hamas, and on the other hand, to oversee Israel's occupation of the West Bank. According to John Allen, Canada's ambassador, the goal of this security system reform. So what Canada is doing is they're building a Palestinian security force under a U.S. general, until recently U.S. General Keith Dayton, who was in Iraq after the American invasion there. And building this Palestinian security force, according to our ambassador, to quote, to ensure that the PA, Palestinian Authority, maintains control of the West Bank against Hamas. So explicitly designed to sow division within Palestinian society, to sow division between the two main political factions, Hamas and Fatah, and it's been successful, right? The Canadian government refused to have relations with the Palestinian Unity Government that was created in March 2007 because there were Hamas officials in that government. They were trying to destroy the government. Canada was the first country to cut off aid to the Palestinian Authority after Hamas won democratic elections in 2006 that Canada was even involved in monitoring. And the goal is to basically weaken Palestinian unity and to support the most compliant Palestinian factions. And we have to remember that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, its electoral mandate ended 2 years ago. So it's not a government that has a democratic mandate anymore. Despite that, Canada has been pumping hundreds or tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into this security system reform. It's part of a 5-year, $300 million Canadian aid program to the Palestinians. And most of that money, according to Peter Kent, is going to Operation Proteus. To get a sense of what this Palestinian security force is all about, during the bombing campaign against Gaza 2 years ago, there were protests in the West Bank. This security force put down those protests. They've arrested hundreds, probably into the thousands, of Palestinians who oppose the Abbas-led authority in the West Bank. There's been polls of Palestinians' attitudes towards their right to demonstrate, their right to dissent over the past few years. And alongside Canadian-American training of the Palestinian security force, people's attitudes have their sense that their freedom to demonstrate has dropped alongside that. So what Canada is trying to do is to build something similar to what you see in Egypt. We have an extensive security apparatus keeping the population in check. And historically, all colonial powers want a local population to do as much of the security work as possible. So the British in India had Indians doing much, if not, well, most of actually, the security work. Likewise with Israel, right? Israel wants to get compliant Palestinian factions to do as much of their dirty work as possible. What's somewhat distinct about this is the fact that it's third parties training this Palestinian security force. That it's the fact that it's Canada, the US, and Britain who are training them both in the West Bank and in Jordan at a security school Americans built after invading Iraq, designed to train Iraqi police that would then go back to Iraq to oversee the American occupation there. The Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence, vets the Palestinian candidates. So they're involved in the process to some extent, but it's mostly third party, and I think that's somewhat distinct in the history of colonialism. So I belabor this point about Operation Proteus simply because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars Canadian aid money. We're talking about something that is not discussed basically at all within the dominant Canadian media, let alone even the left media. Then Canada's pro-Israel policy, which shouldn't really just be seen as a pro-Israel policy, should be seen as a pro-empire policy in the Middle East, extends even to this special tribunal in Lebanon that's going on right now. It's a Canadian who is heading it up and is using it as a way to go after Hezbollah. A couple years ago, 5 years ago, it was a way to go after Syria, and now that that was successful, now they're using it as a way to go after Hezbollah, and it looks like it's leading towards possible civil war in Lebanon.